Hey guys, how's it going? Hope you're doing well. My name is Crown, and today I'm going to read you some very interesting stories that I hope that you're gonna love. And now, without further ado, let's go!
I've been swinging a metal detector for 20 years now. Started when I was a kid with my grandfather's old machine and never stopped. There's something about the anticipation of each beep, the mystery of what's buried beneath your feet, that keeps pulling me back. Over the years, I've found Civil War bullets, old coins, jewelry, you name it. Each discovery feels like a direct connection to the past. My wife got a promotion last spring, which meant we had to pack up and move from our comfortable home in Texas to Oklahoma City. Moving is never fun, but I was actually excited about the possibilities. New neighborhoods mean new ground to explore, new history to uncover. I'd researched the area online and found out our new neighborhood was built in the 1920s, which meant there could be some real treasures waiting underground. We'd only been in the house for 3 days when I couldn't resist anymore. I pulled my trusty detector out of the garage and decided to introduce myself to the neighbors the way I always do, by asking if I could search their yards. Most people are curious about what might be buried on their property, and it's a great way to break the ice. I walked over to the house next door where I had seen an older woman tending her flower beds. She seemed friendly enough, always waved when she saw us unpacking boxes. I introduced myself as her new neighbor and asked if I could do some metal detecting in her yard the next day. I offered to show her anything I might dig up. She looked up from her flowers with a genuine smile and told me that would be fine. She said she'd always wondered what was buried in her yard because her father used to enjoy that same hobby but died before he had the chance to search around their property. She mentioned she'd be working the next day but gave me permission to dig as long as I filled in any holes I made. I thanked her and said I was sorry for the loss of her father. She said it was okay and that it was nice to meet the new neighbors anyway. The next morning I was out there bright and early with my headphones on, methodically sweeping the detector back and forth. The yard was giving me some good signals. Within the first hour I pulled up several wheat pennies from the 1940s and a couple of mercury dimes. These old neighborhoods never disappoint. I was kneeling down, carefully digging around what sounded like another coin, when I heard someone yelling. The problem with headphones is you can hear loud noises but can't tell where they're coming from. I heard someone calling me a jerk in a very aggressive tone. I pulled off my headphones and looked around. A man was standing right there on the yard, his face angry. I'd never seen him before. I asked him politely who he was and why he was yelling at me like that. He immediately started screaming that if I didn't get off that property, he was calling the police. He accused me of trespassing and destroying the woman's property, using some very colorful language to describe me. I stood up slowly, keeping my voice calm. This guy was clearly having some kind of episode, but I wasn't about to let him steamroll me. I told him that first of all, I had permission to be there, and he had no right to scream at me. I explained that if he needed something, all he had to do was ask politely. Instead of backing down, he stepped closer. His hands were clenched into fists. He said he didn't care what I thought I had for permission, and that I was destroying the woman's yard. He wasn't going to stand for it. I explained that I didn't know who he was, but I had spoken to the homeowner yesterday, and she had given me permission to be there. He called me a liar and threatened to beat me up and then call the cops. That's when I knew this wasn't going to end with a reasonable conversation. The guy was completely unhinged. I warned him that if he stepped any farther, I would exercise my right to defend myself. He yelled that he was calling the police and that I was going to get arrested. I told him that was fine and he should go right ahead. I said I would keep digging and would let the cops know that he had threatened to hit me. He walked off toward what I assumed was his house across the street, pulling out his phone and dramatically punching numbers. I went back to my detecting but kept one eye on his house. About 10 minutes later, 2 police cars pulled up. The officers got out and walked over to me. One of them, a middle-aged guy who looked like he'd dealt with plenty of neighborhood disputes, approached first. He politely told me they'd gotten a call from a neighbor claiming I was trespassing on private property. I said I was sorry they had to waste their time on this nonsense. I explained that I had gotten permission from my neighbor yesterday to metal detect her yard. I told him that the man had come outside, started cursing at me, and threatened to beat me up without even asking if I had permission. I mentioned that even after I told him I had permission, he still threatened me. The officer looked over at the house across the street where the man was now standing in his doorway. He asked if that was the neighbor who had complained. When I confirmed it was, the officer sighed and shook his head. He told me he figured as much because that guy was a troublemaker. He said they got several calls from him quite often and that normally they just told people to pay no mind to him. He advised me to call them if the man caused any more trouble. That's when the man came charging back over, apparently having heard our conversation. He demanded to know why they weren't arresting me and insisted I was trespassing. The second officer stepped forward and explained that they had already talked to the homeowner, who confirmed she had given me permission. He said that no crime had been committed. The man started using extremely foul language and called the officers worthless. He kept yelling that I was destroying private property. His voice was getting louder and more aggressive. Other neighbors were starting to come out of their houses to see what the commotion was about. The first officer told him he needed to calm down and return to his home. The man shouted that he didn't have to do anything and that this was America, so he could stand wherever he wanted. The officer corrected him, saying that actually he couldn't just stand anywhere, and if he continued with his behavior, he was going to be arrested. But the man wouldn't stop. He kept screaming, kept using profanity, and even made another threat toward me. That's when the officer's patience ran out. The officer told him to turn around and put his hands behind his back because he was under arrest for disorderly conduct, disturbing the peace, making threats, and filing a false police report. The man's whole demeanor changed instantly. He asked in confusion what was happening and insisted they couldn't arrest him because he was the one who had called them. But it was too late. They cuffed him and put him in the back of one of the patrol cars. The officers took my statement, gave me their card, and told me to call if the man bothered me again. After they left, I went back to detecting, though I kept one eye on his house. About an hour later, I got a strong signal near the back corner of the yard. When I dug it up, I found something special, a small pin with Cub Scouts engraved on it. The style looked like it was from the 1940s, with the old logo design. When my neighbor got home from work that evening, I walked over to show her what I'd found. I told her I had found some interesting things that day, but this one was really special. I handed her the pin, now cleaned up and shining. She gasped and told me it was her father's pin. She said he was so proud of being a Cub Scout and that she hadn't seen the pin in decades. She started tearing up, turning the pin over in her hands. She explained that she thought all his childhood things were lost when her grandmother's house flooded years ago. I offered to frame it for her if that would be okay, along with a picture of the old Cub Scout logo from that era. When I brought it back to her a few days later, properly framed with the historical context, she thanked me repeatedly. It turned out to be one of the most meaningful finds I've ever made, not because of its monetary value, but because of what it meant to someone else. I never saw that man outside his house again after that day. My boyfriend and I had been living together for 4 years and were pretty serious. We'd been house hunting for months, but nothing worked out, so we decided to just renew our lease for another year and keep looking. Everything seemed fine between us, and he was supportive when I told him about a Mexico trip I was planning to take with friends. He even helped me research the resort and joked about how jealous he was that I'd be getting massages while he was stuck at work. Then everything changed the week before Thanksgiving. His dad had a sudden heart attack and died within hours. My boyfriend immediately flew across the country to be with his mom and help with arrangements. I completely understood why he stayed there for the holiday instead of coming home. Losing a parent is devastating and his family needed him. But when he called to tell me the funeral date, I was mesmerized. It was scheduled for the Friday after I was supposed to leave for Mexico. I immediately told him I'd look into changing my plans. I promised to call the travel company first thing the next morning to see what options we had. He thanked me and said he knew the timing was terrible. I spent the next day on the phone with customer service, but the news wasn't good. Since we'd booked as a group through a special wellness package deal, everything was completely non-refundable. Even if someone got sick or had an emergency, there were no exceptions. The representative was sympathetic but firm about their policy. I called my 3 friends to see if they'd be willing to reschedule the whole trip, but none of them could get the time off work again. Two of them had already used most of their vacation days for the year, and the third had a big work presentation the following week that she couldn't move. When I called my boyfriend back with the bad news, I tried to explain everything gently. I told him how sorry I was, but that the entire trip was non-refundable, and I had looked into every possible option. He asked about rescheduling, so I explained that my friends couldn't get time off work again and how terrible I felt about the timing. Then he asked what I was going to do. I took a deep breath before telling him I thought I had to go because I couldn't afford to lose all that money for nothing. I explained how I had saved for months to make this happen. There was a long pause before he said we'd talk more when he got back. When he returned home a few days later, he seemed surprisingly understanding about everything. He listened while I apologized over and over, explaining how awful I felt about the timing, but how I couldn't justify throwing away thousands of dollars. He said he got it and that the money thing made sense. I was so relieved that he wasn't angry. We talked about how hard things had been for both of us lately, and I felt like we were going to get through this together. But then I brought up renewing our lease, since I wanted to get the paperwork signed before I left for the trip. I asked if we should call the landlord tomorrow to set up the lease renewal meeting. He dropped the bombshell. He said he actually wasn't renewing the lease anymore. I stared at him, completely confused, and asked what he meant since we had already decided to renew and keep house hunting. He explained that he'd been thinking while he was away and had decided to go back after the funeral to stay with his mom for a while because she needed help getting things sorted out. I asked him how long he'd be gone and why he didn't talk to me about this before making such a big decision. He said he was talking to me about it right now and that his mom was struggling, so he needed to be there for her. The casual way he was dropping this bombshell on me was shocking. I asked what I was supposed to do about a place to live and whether I should start apartment hunting. He told me to figure it out with my friends on my vacation. I told him he was putting me in an impossible situation and reminded him that he had seemed totally fine with me going on this trip. He said he wasn't going to beg me to cancel and that I had made my choice, so now he was making his. I said that wasn't fair and called him a jerk for springing this on me at the last minute. I told him we should have discussed this together like adults. His calm facade cracked. He asked if he was the jerk when I was the one who had decided that drinking cocktails on a beach was more important than being at his father's funeral. He said if anyone was a jerk, it was me. I was stunned by how he'd twisted everything around. I told him that wasn't what this was about and he knew it. I reminded him that I couldn't afford to lose that money and that he had said he understood. He said he had said a lot of things, but watching me choose my vacation over his dad's funeral had showed him exactly where he stood in my priorities. I argued that his dad's death was a tragedy, but that didn't give him the right to make major life decisions that affected both of us without even discussing it first. He compared it to how I had discussed missing the funeral with him. I said that was completely different because I had explained the financial situation and he had said it was okay. He clarified that he had said he understood my reasoning, but had never said he was okay with it. We went around in circles for another hour, but it was clear he'd already made up his mind. He was moving out whether I liked it or not. What started trying to salvage a non-refundable vacation had somehow turned into him abandoning our entire life together. He made me feel like the villain in the whole situation. Yes, the timing was awful. Yes, I wished I could be there for the funeral, but I wasn't choosing a vacation over his grief. I was trying not to lose thousands of dollars that I'd worked hard to save. I went on the Mexico trip, but it was nothing like the relaxing getaway I'd planned. Instead of meditating on the beach, I spent most of my time frantically searching for apartments online and dealing with the stress of suddenly being homeless. My friends tried to be supportive, but they clearly thought I was in the wrong too. When I got back, he was already gone. He'd taken his stuff and left his key on the kitchen counter. Our landlord was surprisingly understanding and let me out of the lease early when I explained the situation, but finding a new place on such short notice was a nightmare. 3 weeks later, I found out through mutual friends that he had already moved back to our city and was living in a nice apartment downtown. Apparently, staying with his mom to help her through things had lasted all of 2 weeks before he decided he needed his own space again. He'd used his father's death to end things while making me look like the heartless girlfriend who chose vacation over family. I ran into his sister at the grocery store a month later. She mentioned how much she'd been looking forward to meeting me at the funeral. It turns out he'd never even told his family I had a scheduling conflict. He just said I couldn't make it without any explanation. I realized then that he'd been looking for an excuse to end things, and my non-refundable trip had given him the perfect opportunity to play the victim while making me the bad guy. I started working at this movie theater chain when I was 22. Most nights were pretty routine, but this one evening about 12 years ago still makes me chuckle when I think about it. I've been a manager there for about 8 months when this happened. I was working the closing shift, which meant staying until the last movie ended and making sure everything was locked up properly. The last movie had already started around 9:30 p.m., and I was in the back office counting the cash drawers and filling out the daily paperwork. Most of the staff had already gone home except for one usher, a new kid who'd only been working there for about 2 weeks. His job was simple: walk through the theaters during the last showings to make sure everything was okay, then say goodnight to customers when they left. The other manager, who was supposed to help me close, asked if he could leave early since things were so quiet. I didn't see any problem with that. It was just me, the usher, and maybe 40 people total watching the last few movies. What could go wrong? About 15 minutes after the other manager left, I got a call on the office phone. The usher was asking me to come out front because some customers wanted to talk to me. I figured someone probably wanted a refund or had a complaint about the temperature in their theater. When I walked out from behind the concession counter, I found the usher standing there with 2 elderly women who looked pretty upset. The first lady asked if I was the manager, and when I said yes and asked what I could help them with, she explained their concern. There was a situation in Theater 6 involving a man who had been yelling at his wife for the past 20 minutes. The second lady added that they thought he'd been drinking, and they were honestly worried he might get violent with her. The first lady went on to say that they had asked their husbands to intervene, but the men didn't want to get involved. They felt that someone needed to do something before the situation got worse. I could tell they were genuinely concerned, not just complaining about noise. I thanked them and told them I'd handle it right away. They headed back to their theater while I turned to the usher. I told him to come with me and to stay close but not get in the way if things got heated. We walked toward Theater 6, and I could already hear raised voices before we even got to the door. I decided to hang back in the hallway for a minute to assess the situation before going in. What I heard made my stomach turn. This guy was absolutely screaming at his wife about spilling popcorn, calling her useless and stupid. His voice was slurred, and he sounded completely out of control. I knew I had to act fast. I walked into the theater and immediately spotted them. They were sitting about halfway down, and the guy was still berating his wife in a voice loud enough for the entire theater to hear. When he saw me approaching, he didn't even try to lower his voice. Instead, he rudely asked what I wanted, calling me a jerk. I walked up the steps toward their row, trying to keep my voice calm. I told him I needed him to keep his voice down because he was disturbing the other customers' movie experience. He angrily replied that he'd do whatever he pleased and that this was between him and his wife. I took a step back, partly because of his aggressive tone and partly because I almost stepped on a cup that had rolled into the aisle. I looked up at the elderly couples who had complained. The husbands looked terrified and were clearly not going to help. The guy's wife just sat there staring at her lap like this was normal for her. I told him I understood he was upset, but I was going to have to ask him to leave because he was being disruptive and other customers had complained. That's when he stood up. This guy was huge, probably 6'4" and built like he worked construction. I'm about 5'9" on a good day, so suddenly I was looking up at him instead of down. He made it clear he wasn't going anywhere, calling me kid in a dismissive tone. I could smell the alcohol on his breath from 3 feet away. I looked over at my usher, who looked like he was about to run. Then one of the elderly ladies behind us spoke up, telling him that I was the manager and he needed to listen to me. That seemed to make the guy even angrier. I told him he really needed to leave now and that this was his final warning. He challenged me, saying I was going to have to make him leave. The way he said it, rolling up his sleeves and clenching his fists, made it clear where this was heading. I knew I had to think fast. I agreed that if that's what it took, then fine. But not in the theater, we'd have to take it outside. I turned and started walking toward the exit, hoping he'd follow. I whispered to the usher when I passed him, telling him to call the police immediately. The usher nodded and hurried out while the drunk guy started following me, muttering threats under his breath. My heart was pounding, but I tried to look confident when we walked through the lobby toward the side exit. The guy threatened me, saying I'd picked the wrong night to mess with him. I explained that I just didn't want to get fired for fighting on company property, so we had to do this outside away from the cameras. I pointed toward the emergency exit that led to the side parking lot. He started walking that way with his chest puffed out, probably thinking about how he was going to teach me a lesson. I followed behind him, taking off my name tag and loosening my tie like I was getting ready for a fight. He pushed through the emergency door with both hands, stepping out into the cool night air. I was right behind him, and the second I was through the doorway, I grabbed the door handle and pulled it shut behind me. The beautiful thing about emergency exits is that they lock automatically from the outside. The guy stood there for a few seconds, probably wondering why I wasn't squaring up to fight him, before he realized what had happened. He started yelling, asking what I'd done and demanding that I open the door. He started pounding on the glass with his fists, then kicking it when that didn't work. I could see the glass starting to crack, but I just stood there on the other side smiling and tapping my watch. I told him the police should be there any minute since we were right next to the station. That made him even more furious. He was screaming and hitting the door so hard I was worried he might actually break through, but thankfully, I could already hear sirens in the distance. 2 police cars pulled up just when the guy was trying to find something to throw at the door. The officers got out and immediately put him in handcuffs while he screamed about how I tricked him. I have to admit, watching him get arrested felt pretty satisfying. One of the officers came over to talk to me while his partner put the guy in the back of their car. He asked what had happened, so I explained the whole situation, from the complaints about his behavior in the theater to how he'd threatened me and demanded we fight outside. The officer nodded and asked if we had security cameras. I said that we did and told him I could get him the footage of everything from when the guy left the theater until he went outside. I went back inside and pulled up the video on our security system, burning it to a disk for the police. While I was doing that, the last movie ended and people started filing out. The drunk guy's wife came out with everyone else, and I felt like I should probably tell her what happened to her husband. When I explained that he'd been arrested for disturbing the peace and threatening me, her reaction surprised me. She said it was good, and that maybe a night in jail would teach him some manners. She added that this wasn't the first time he'd embarrassed her like this. She thanked me for handling the situation and walked out to her car like nothing had happened. I felt bad for her. You could tell this was just another Tuesday night in her life. The elderly ladies who had originally complained stopped by the concession counter on their way out. They thanked me for taking care of the situation, saying they were really worried about that poor woman. After everyone left, I went back to the office to finish my closing paperwork. The drunk guy never came back to our theater, but his wife did. She actually became a regular customer and always made sure to say hello when she saw me. She seemed a lot happier after that night. And now we have reached the end of today's stories. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.